focus on change comes originally from the early Buddhist perception of anicca, or impermanence. But if you look through Buddhist history, you'll see that over the ages, the notion of impermanence has itself been impermanent. I'm not surprised. It's changed over time in some lineages. For example, if you work within the U Ba Khin lineage, which involves the technique of body sweeping, where you systematically move the awareness up and down through the body and eventually in other patterns also. So you're making these sort of reciprocal scans of somatic awareness. This tends to create an awareness of a subtle, vibratory, bubbly flavor of flow that people find very pleasant. They are very carefully instructed not to form an attachment to that, but simply observe what is. And then sometimes the opposite of that happens. Everything gets very solid and intense and horrific. And okay, don't form an aversion to that. Just keep sweeping through. It's a brilliant innovation because it gets you down to a very fine scale of somatic resolution. And at that scale, the vibratory nature of the nervous system, the vibratory nature of nature, will present itself to you. And U Ba Khin talked about that as impermanence. That's anicca. But whereas the Buddha talked about it, always linked impermanence to dukkha, right? Things pass and we hold on to them and we set ourselves up for suffering, pinning our happiness on things that aren't going to last. Here we get, in the U Ba Khin lineage, a positive take on impermanence. It's a kind of purifying energy that gets activated within you and starts to work on you, which sort of links it to notions of the Holy Spirit working on you, energia, long, long before that was ever used in physics in its present meaning. It was used by Christian monks and nuns to describe the energia, the working N, with the ergia, the working N within one of the Holy Spirit that sort of dissolves the somethingness and the impurities within you. Well, U Ba Khin calls that activating impermanence, and he puts a positive spin on impermanence, and while at the same time, of course, acknowledging the original Buddhist notion of impermanence as a possible source of suffering. Like a good scientist, built on the work of the Buddha, or either he or whoever his teachers were that came up with this notion. My own teacher, Joshu Sasaki Roshi, has vastly innovated with regards to the notion of change or impermanence. He likes to describe it in terms of expansion and contraction. To say that when you look carefully, you see that all the different flavors of flow that can occur, vibratory, undulatory, even inward, outward pressures, and so forth, these can all be interpreted in terms of two fundamental flow patterns. One expansion, the other contraction. You could have a sensation that's as solid as a rock, but if you analyze the pressure, you can usually find there's an outward pressure and an inward pressure. Oh yeah, they're banging together and clashing and producing a horrific pain. But the fact is, if you let the part that wants to press in, and the part that wants to push out, if you let that happen, it gets worse at some point. They interdigitate. And yes, indeed, it's just expansion and contraction, empty space. So you can take solid experiences and work with them. And he gives this gigantic list of synonyms for expansion and contraction. Expansion, or you can call it life. You can call it affirmation. You can call it Future, you can call it outside. And then contraction, you can call it death, you can call it negation, you can call it past, you can call it inside. So all these synonyms, many of which don't seem to have anything in common if you get attached to the words. But then if you listen deeply, you'll see that they're pairs of binary contrasts that in some way or another involve the notion of affirmation versus negation, or bigness versus smallness. In the Path of Purification, the Visuddhimagga, which is sort of like the classic commentary on the Buddhist canon used in much of Southeast Asia, there's a place where the author Buddhaghosa describes a stage in practice where you're observing the rising and passing of phenomena. And then you become aware that no sooner does something arise, but it also passes. Udaya bhaya is the word that's used in Pali. Udaya is rising up, vyaya is passing away. So at some point there is a simultaneous udaya and vyaya. But it's described as it's passing as soon as it's arising. Instead of saying observing phenomena rising and passing, or even passing, arising and passing simultaneously, Sasaki Roshi says, be aware of simultaneous expansion and contraction. Now, why is that a subtle but significant paradigm shift? Well, if you listen to his talks, he'll sometimes get real emphatic. He'll get up there and he'll bang his fan, and he'll raise his voice. It's whoa. And a lot of times what he gets most emphatic about is something you can't remotely understand. Either you can't understand it, or it seems like absolutely a banal triviality. Sometimes he'll get up there and he bangs his fan and he says, you must never forget, never forget, never forget. As soon as you turn to the west, the east is behind you. As soon as you turn to the east, the west is behind you. Never forget that. It's like, what? It's like, yeah, but you got to listen with the wisdom mind, okay? As soon as you turn to the west, the east is there. As soon as you expand, contraction is there, okay? It's like any binary contrast to him exemplifies these principles, okay? Never, in other words, never forget, as soon as there seems to be a rising, passing is right there. That's what he's talking about, but he'll never tell you that, okay? You got to figure that out. Then he'll get up there and he'll say, you'll never get enlightenment doing two-dimensional Zen. Flat Zen is not Zen. Real Zen is spherical. Real Zen is a ball, simultaneously expanding and contracting. Never do flat Zen. What's flat Zen? Flat Zen is, I'm over here observing rising and passing over there. Once you start thinking in terms of expansion and contraction, the observer gets yanked into the process and dissolved. So the three-dimensionality of it prevents the fixation of the sense of an observer, which is the main criticism Zen tends to give to Vipassana practice. Instead, be aware, as soon as something is arising, three-dimensional space is expanding and three-dimensional space are contracting. You and surrounding scene are a spherical surface being gestated into existence and annihilated by the simultaneous fountain of the efflux and reflux of the source, which is not a thing. It's a pure doing. Sasaki Roshi sometimes says, a good doctor can cure your illness, but only the greatest doctors can show you you were never sick.